Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second live debate of the Sphera YouTube channel. Thank you very much for being here. Spring has arrived. As you may have seen, I am actually in Paris right now, and the flowers are back, and the temperatures as well. And just for second live debate, we wanted to take a look at what have been happening on the EU Green Deal. So just to do a reminder to our audiences, so almost 2 years ago, the European Commission has presented a set of 15 European legislations on what they call the EU Green Deal, on how we can really for Europe to be climate neutral by 2030. So there have been a lot of fuss, a lot of drama, a lot of discussions, a lot of files. I think, if I'm not mistaken, right now, we are talking of a legislation of 3,000 pages at least of climate regulations. And the problem right now, things are messy, as it is anything in Brussels. Things can be messy, and we wanted right now to have some kind of someone who can be a lighthouse, someone that can really help us to guide through this maze. So that's why we are organizing this live today with a brilliant journalist. Her name is Kalina Oroschakoff. Hi, Kalina.
Hi, Quentin.
Super. Let me just introduce a bit yourself to the audience. So, Kalina, you are an Austrian journalist based in Brussels, but also have lived a lot in Germany and the UK and so on. And right now, you are the climate reporter covering Europe for one of the biggest German-speaking Swiss media, which is NZZ. And just full disclaimer, we have been colleagues with Kalina back in the day, and she was already working on climate. And every time I was lost on energy and climate issues, I would actually ring Kalina. Actually, I would not even ring because our desks were just next to each other.
Exactly.
So we would just Kalina explain to me. Kalina, just to continue to the demonstration, she has been really working on climate issues from basically all the spectrum of what climate reporting is in Brussels. So she has been covering negotiations in the European Parliament, the European Commission, but also all the COPs. So she was at the COP in Paris, at several COPs as well. And she's doing more and more features and stories on the ground on really how climate policies completely are working on and here. So basically, she's the best person to talk to.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction.
You're welcome. So thank you for that. Maybe if I can just, my first question would be, okay, Kalina, can you explain to someone who is not in Brussels on what is going on right now on the EU Green Deal? So this thing has been presented 2 years ago. It's a mess. There's a lot of acronyms. But if we have to explain it to someone who is not in Brussels, is not following the issues that closely as we do, how should we do it?
Well, first of all, thanks again for inviting me, and very nice to be back, almost working with you. As you told the audience, we used to be colleagues sitting next to each other, so it's nice to see your face. It's so close. Thanks also for the question too. I think to discuss the European Green Deal, we need to take a few steps backwards. And you already mentioned COPs. So for everyone who's listening and isn't familiar with climate jargon, and there's no good reason why you should be, the COP is is the UN climate conference, climate negotiations that happen every year. Why Quentin also mentioned Paris is because in 2015, the world agreed to the Paris Climate Agreement. And with that, essentially, the world agreed to do more to cut emissions in order to keep temperatures, global warming to certain limits. And the two goals that you will hear and read about a lot are the 1.5 degree goal and well below 2 degrees. So that's what at the time was agreed. The EU was a major player at the time, has always seen itself as a climate leader for various reasons. And now coming to the Green Deal is very much the promise of the EU to the world that you can be climate friendly, so you can reduce emissions, you become more sustainable in your economy and the way you live, as well as creating economic value and growing. So that's the promise that the EU has made to the world, and it's the promise that the EU wants to prove is possible. Now, it's called the Green Deal. At a time when also the US, for example, was talking about the new Green Deal. So you can see that over the last years, you had a lot of new deals emerging, again, with this promise of we can be sustainable and environmentally, as well as economically. And now, Quentin was already mentioning, obviously the EU being the regulatory beast that it is, a couple of years ago then put out a lot of regulations, at least proposals for regulations, to make sure that the targets that it set itself can be turned into reality. And when we talk about the climate targets of the EU, we talk about two in particular. The big headline target is climate neutrality by 2050. So that means that the EU intends to reduce emissions as far as possible to zero, and then somehow compensate or balance out those emissions that can't be reduced. There's a reason for that, because, for example, industries like cement and aviation, as well as certain other sectors, won't be able to reduce their emissions fully, just because the process, for example, will always create emissions, or because it's just technically almost impossible. And so that's why it's called climate neutrality or net zero emissions, so that you kind of like net it out, balance it out. So that's the headline target. That's essentially what the Green Deal wants to reach. So it's a few decades away. In order to then obviously make sure that the EU stays on course, and as all of you know, it's 27 countries, so to make sure that everyone stays disciplined, the EU also agreed or is in the process of agreeing interim targets. The big target that we're talking about now is a target for 2030. So we're now talking about in 7 years' time to reduce emissions by net 55%. So again, we have that awkward net in there. So the idea is to reduce emissions almost by 55% and the rest to be absorbed by trees, plants, other plants, peatlands. So that's why, for example, in wherever you sit, you will probably hear your governments talking about trying to restore forests or trying to restore peatlands and all of these things.
Like all the tree mania in Europe right now, and you see like politicians and planting trees like across the continent saying like carbon emission, carbon emission.
Exactly. Right. Everyone's become a tree hugger. Obviously, there are lots of difficulties and challenges with that as well. But so these are the two targets we're talking about. And then when you were talking about this big mess in Brussels, what has been going on for the past 2 years is that then the EU said, okay, how do we manage this? How do we cut emissions by almost 55 or by as close as 55% as possible? And now you have this incredible roster of proposals, some of them which have already been turned into laws after negotiations, which target, for example, the share of renewables in the energy system, energy efficiency. So how much and how fast can we save energy in the way we live or the way we produce things, the way we just move around.
Yeah.
Then transport emissions, how can we target the transport sector? How can we make sure that people either drive less polluting cars or switch to more environmentally friendly fuels? So that's a big discussion. Then you have regulations that target agriculture. Very difficult subject, because obviously we're talking about a sector that produces food, that is extremely powerful when it comes to political representation, which has, and especially in countries like France,
in the Netherlands recently.
Or in the Netherlands, exactly, kind of also capture the public imagination, because it's easy to create narratives of, people versus food versus government versus the environment versus survival. So you have a lot of very emotive issues that come together there. And so that's how the EU is trying to, or when I talk about the EU, in the beginning, the European Commission is trying to make these targets a reality. And then you have the countries and the European Parliament negotiate. And currently we're in the middle of that.
Okay. And just like from you, like as someone who has been following, like it's not the first time you are watching like EU bureaucrats from the Commission, Parliament, and basically Brussels like hustling on finding targets. Do you think right now like there is a chance to get there? Because like if we take a look at the previous targets, okay, like it's not the first time the EU has been setting targets to itself just to reduce its emissions. It's more or less worked. And if we talk to scientists and so on, there is some kind of a debate to say, okay, yes, but maybe like it's more economic crisis or economic shocks, which basically means that emissions that are being reduced rather than really investment into green energies that makes it like making reducible. So I was wondering from you, like just for someone who has been taking a look at let's look at those issues, just like do you think this works, and do you think right now there is a chance for the EU actually to get there and really to slash emissions? Because having like slashing like emissions by half in 7 years sounds rather challenging.
It definitely is very, very challenging. And I mean, you were already referencing previous targets. I mean, the EU managed to reach its emission reduction target by 2020, which was a 20% emissions cut, which was at the time considered quite ambitious. And now it's obviously, when we look around, see already what is happening in terms of climate impacts, could probably be considered not that ambitious, which is also why we had this enormous jump now to 55%, which was already an increase on what governments had agreed on a couple of years ago. So there are a few things to to observe in that sense. So on the one hand, targets are becoming tougher and tougher and tougher. So the political will, at least not the political will, the political commitment to targets certainly is there. And now, and you say time is running out, we see that it's getting extremely hard to reach some of those targets. And especially when you look at the sectoral targets, which is a very abstract term to just say, how much wind turbines, how many solar power plants, how many other renewable installations will we have standing and producing power by 2030. You can see how tricky it will be to reach these targets, because despite all the symbolisms, despite all the rhetoric, there's not enough renewables being rolled out, which is why you have a lot of difficult discussions. And I guess also your viewers, you will probably have come across it. There's communities have issues with new wind parks being built in their neighborhood. People think wind turbines are ugly, or people want to have a say in these wind parks, for example, which is legitimate. Solar power plants run into permitting challenges all across the EU. Renewable energy installations run into permitting challenges. It takes years to build a plant, sometimes up to 10 years. And if you think about it, up to 10 years is already beyond 2030. And so I think there's a lot of challenges to reach these targets. I always find it difficult to say targets will be met or not, because in a political world, over the years, things are always tuned and fine-tuned so that in the end, it doesn't really matter. You kind of like spin it forward. And I guess there's a broader question: how relevant are targets? Many people would say you need targets to set the tone, to set the direction, which is especially something that companies and industry wants. They want a longer-term trajectory that they can then allocate their resources towards, put their money in, change the production processes, which have long running times as well. In terms of the numbers, I have the feeling that we'll probably see over the next few years a major acceleration in some green industries, especially, for example, the cost for renewables have fallen drastically over the last years and decades, much faster than people and analysts had originally expected. Those are good news. And so you see globally investments are being ramped up. So the signals are there.
Yeah. Okay. This is great. I think that's why, you are a good journalist, because you are the best at doing transitions, because this is really the question I wanted to ask you now, which is, okay, like it sounds like very cheap right now to produce, like with your solar panels and so on, really to reduce your energy bills and so on and so forth. But if we take a look at one of the big resistance that we have seen over the last years in Europe is also like, who is going to pay for the energy transition? Like there have been the gilets jaunes, so the yellow vest in France, about like the price of oil. Recently, even in the Netherlands, like there have been really the Dutch government actually is forced to by a legal decision to cut back its agricultural emissions, but farmers are revolting against. And actually, the Farmers Party, like the new Farmers Party, have been winning a lot of seats recently out of the blue. So it means like right now there is a lot of social resistance right now. And how do we overcome those kind of issues? Because, for example, like, okay, if we go back to the EU nitty-gritty, like we should have very soon some kind of a European climate fund. So basically, how to help households and SMEs to renovate their houses and so on, especially if they are too reliant on gas. But like, how do you overcome those social and
Mm.
environmental tensions right now? Like, based on your view of from many European countries. Like, do you have some kind of a nice example you can point out?
There's some interesting examples, but just as a broader point, what you were saying in the beginning, I fully agree with. The transition is costly, not just in terms of financing that is needed, but it's also costly because people and regions will lose out in the process, as is always the case in any major transformation. I mean, the idea is that you really change the way our economy is functioning, which means certain ways of doing things will no longer, if you think it through, be relevant, which means people will lose out. That in itself creates tension and creates resistance, which is understandable and in many cases legitimate. Because I think one of the major challenges that people sometimes forget is that targets are on an EU-wide level, or like ambitions are formulated in an EU-wide level. That, of course, ignores that individual regions or towns, places will be hit, which requires, in a national context, to make political deals, to make, as you say, you're talking about a social climate fund, to come up with new payments to weather these hardships for people. So I would argue that the biggest omission for many, many years was that politicians weren't actually addressing this reality. So the total lack of honesty, that this might be good for the planet, this might be good for the environment, all of these things are fair, but this will also hurt. And as you say, renewables are advancing majorly, costs are falling. However, also the transition into a new energy system costs money. Energy will continue to cost money. Heating your home will continue to cost money. Driving a car will continue to cost money. Everything costs money. And I would argue that in terms of the honesty about these cost factors, there's not been much openness around it. And you see it in difficult debates. You'd see it in debates, for example, in Germany, where they're discussing the CO2 price, or across the EU. How do you incentivize people to switch out of fossil fuels, for example, in the car, and start switching to an electric vehicle? This idea is like, okay, you put a price on it. Now everyone can see, damn it, it's really expensive. So everyone freaks out. The challenge is, though, if you do it via regulations or bans, it will also be expensive. You just wouldn't see the cost as obviously as you would with a CO2 price, for example. So this has to be navigated politically in terms of how you communicate it. So that I would say is a first step, because people aren't stupid. They can handle challenges if you communicate it and communicate why you do something.
Yeah, I think this is a super important point here. Just like, people are not stupid, and this is one of the things. No, but like, it's kind of strange. Like, you arrive in like when you see climate issues or climate politics, like a lot of people would like to renovate their houses. A lot of people would like really to switch to like cheaper cars, like cars we emit less. Like, they really want to do that. The problem right now is just like it costs a lot of money. Just for me, just I changed my boiler recently. Like, so they also, like, from the 1970s. It was time to change the boiler. But like, it cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And
And
so
so you need to come up with support schemes.
yeah.
You need to come up with ways of actually making information available so that people understand where they can go to, for example, get support. Exactly. Like, look, you stand in front of your boiler, you realize you need to change it. Where do you even know or find out where you can tap into the government subsidy schemes? And there's a lot of them now. Then, of course, there's a whole other debate that raises the question, to what extent are these subsidy schemes sustainable in terms of the budgets of governments? But that's a different debate. But the idea that you need the support, I think everyone knows. And now the question is how to design that support in the most efficient way. Also without wasting money, because then there's the second you have subsidies, every industry will lobby the shit out of it, just to make sure that they get all the subsidies, irrespective of when they need it. So that's a different discussion, though. But
like the problem with climate politics is just as soon as you dive into the issue, like we can spend like hours talking about it because like it has an effect everywhere. But I think you're on deadline, so I will let you go. Maybe one last question is just like you are like I think also for me from a journalistic point of view right now, like you are one of the reporters who really work on climate like really across borders. So you are working for a Swiss Swiss-based newspaper. You live in Brussels, but you travel all around Europe by train or not by train, depending on if it's possible or not. Just really to to report for you So you are seeing climate with a European perspective. So I was wondering maybe from your job as a journalist and a journalist standpoint, how journalists should also are journalists getting better also at covering the climate emergency crisis, and also and what kind of different spices we need actually to incorporate into our reporting just for the stories to get better on reporting the climate.
There's a few things that have changed the last years. I would argue one good thing is that even general assignment reporters or reporters sitting on the economics and politics desks have to deal more and more with climate issues, simply because the climate agenda has moved from a purely environmental issue, so sitting within the environment ministries of countries or energy ministries of countries, to becoming a broad government priority. As symbolic as that might just be in certain cases, but still, climate change it's now a big issue. When you look at some of the recent geopolitical conflicts, you can see it affects trade relations, it affects competitiveness, it affects geopolitics. And so in that sense, more and more journalists are dealing with it, which I argue is a good thing, because it shows that climate change is a horizontal issue and not just a niche. One challenging thing about covering climate change is that climate change is not a closed news story. Like it's an ongoing process. Emissions, unfortunately, continue to rise. Temperatures continue to go up, which means impacts will become starker. Many of you will have experienced heat waves last summer. Many of you will have seen extreme weather events, be that in their consequence, be that droughts, be that also all the conditions that make forest fires more likely. All of these developments will become more prevalent. So you can't really cover it as a one story and then it's done, but it's an ongoing process that will affect our lives, no matter what we do. And so that's a challenge in how you approach it and what kind of stories you tell, because it doesn't have a beginning and an end in that sense. So the beauty of that is, if one can call it beauty, is that there's a lot of various angles you can take. So you can be a reporter and say, okay, I really want to focus on the transition and the solutions to cutting emissions, or the solutions to adapting, the challenges that you come across on the way. Or you can be a reporter and say, I would really, we really dig in what this means in terms of the regional implications. If you live in Italy, you can write story after story about the consequences of drought for farming communities, the consequence of drought for the farming industry, and all the politics around that. Then also it requires accountability journalism, because there's one challenge that also emerges now with everyone being obsessed with climate change, that everyone says everything is climate change. That's just not true. Whether an impact hits really hard has a lot to do with how well you prepared for it. So horrors, as you could see in, for example, in Germany, when the floods came, they don't have to be that extreme. If the politicians have actually invested money
into water management, they won't have been an issue.
And so these are questions we have to ask as well, because otherwise it gets a little bit too easy. because it's not like God-given shocks that you can't get around with. And so I think there's a lot of space there to navigate in climate journalism, which becomes a broader, general accountability exercise.
Cool. Thank you very much, Kalina, for all your insights. I know you're on deadline, so we are going to shut it off now. But continue to stay for the Sphera Live Debate. Please do follow Kalina Oroschakoff on Twitter. Like, your Twitter handle is Macaro.
Exactly.
Right. Super. We will just do that in the chat. And thank you again for your time, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much, Quentin. Bye-bye.